Hello again. We are on week 9 and we are looking at the mechanics of oppression and privilege. And we discovered this wonderful resource called a step tool that I believe is very, very effective in demonstrating the progress or the progressive nature of the sort of continuum of oppression. Certainly, what it does for us, it demonstrates it clearly that how oppression is entrenched, internalized, and perpetuated through a variety of the steps. And the steps represent various topics that we have been dealing with in our class. For example, we know that, we talked about biases, etc., and how those biases that we have talked about created. Most times people either have selected or limited information about a person, the individual or group, or they basically have misinformation about the individual or group, or they are evaluating the individual or group against a certain standard. This step talks about it as being either Eurocentric, patriarchal, classist, ableist, etc. But at this point, it's the information that informs the biases that makes the difference. If you remember, when I talked about discrimination and prejudice, I mentioned that very often people's biases are a consequence of fear of the other, fear of the unknown, not knowing enough about the person. The instinctive reaction is one of fear. And when those fears are realized in things like media, moral panic, where you see certain groups represented more than others, let's say in crime, then that produces a kind of situations in which those biases can become stereotypes. And we can see clearly how, let me take the issue of the crime again, because when we look at who are the people who are involved in stereotypes, so at this stage, when we look at how selective information and biases contribute to the formation of stereotypes and the impact of stereotypes on individuals as well on their outcomes, and we talked about outcomes of schooling, for example. We talk about who is represented in the criminal justice system. I mentioned, for example, in our discussion around discrimination and prejudice, that although First Nations people or indigenous peoples represent only 4% of the population, they are 22% of the prison population. And I did reference the fact that the explanation given for that primarily has to do with the kinds of stereotypes that are created in terms of them in the criminal justice system, and the fact that they do not have the same advantages that others have. For example, very often the homeless don't have fixed addresses, etc. So they are more policed, and they are the surveillance and all the time, which means they are more likely to be apprehended. And if they are doing something illegal, they are more likely to be caught. And since they do not have the socioeconomic conditions that would allow them to be able to live in fixed addresses or to, give some form of security in the system, they usually end up in prison. So we see the idea of stereotypes, how pervasive they are. I did mention as well, that stereotypes, in fact, can actually have some little bit of truth in them that people exaggerate on because they do not understand the historical background. I talked about black youth, for example, and people saying that they're very good at basketball. And I did mention if the expectations that you have of achievement has been projected to you as achievement only in that direction, well, the stereotype becomes, a natural choice, all right, a rational choice for you. In the same way, if the stereotype is that you are a failure in school, etc., is very likely that that can result in self-fulfilling prophecy. So, what is the relationship between those stereotypes and prejudices? Well, when we have a stereotype, we form an opinion of an individual or group based on misinformation that we have gathered, based on biases that we have about that individual or group. Then, when we start judging others in the group, or the group as a whole, when we start judging them based on those biases and stereotypes, here we have a situation in which attitudes are formed towards an individual or group, where we have people becoming intolerant of them and of their presence, distrusting them, and therefore not in any way representing them in a very positive light. The effect of that is that if you just have, as I mentioned, we all have prejudices. If you have no opportunity or you have no power to act on those prejudices, then they remain prejudices. But as I said in my previous session, the problem with prejudice is that prejudice invokes discrimination. And that means that when people are in positions of authority and power, that they do have the ability and the opportunity to deny people their rights and their privileges, etc., based on their prejudices. So what happens is, for example, women have suffered until very recently and still do so, very much so in the labor market. It still is that women still have wage disparity. It still is that they are not getting the same wages for jobs that men do. People talk about, for example, I'm an educator, the feminization of the teaching profession, when that is depicted as sort of a prejudice against women. In that light, what it means is that that profession is not valued as it should be. It means that people are discriminated against. Another one is immigration. There is this view that, people who are recent arrivals, the perception is that, because of their language skills, etc., that they do not have the competence in many professional activities. So I'm sure you see the videos of about doctors driving taxi cabs, and you see the videos all about people who have an MBA, cleaning offices, etc. So they are kept back because again of these biases that inform people's prejudices. Okay, the steps continue and it gets deeper and deeper. I think the problem that we face is when institutional policies themselves provoke that kind of discrimination. The question of immigration is one such thing. For example, many recent immigrants, when they arrive in the country, they arrive in the country with high levels of education. They get into the country because of the high levels of education. The point system allots the majority of the points to, in fact, one's education. So you get into the country because of your education, and when you get into the country, then you realize that the education that you thought was getting you there is not considered to be commensurate with the education in your home country, and you have to retrain, etc. So at that particular situation is an example of how you can get systemic discrimination. All someone has to do not to employ you is to attach some little caveat. For example, you could have the same qualifications as everyone else, but they can say, well, you don't know French or you don't know enough English, etc. And many people, that's why you get all these stories about doctors driving taxi cabs, etc. So that's really what we talk about when we talk about systemic. That very often, in fact, at the state or at the institutional level, discrimination is in place. A good example of that, a practical example of the isms is, for example, racial profiling. So much has been said about it. You are going to look at the what would you do, if something happens. And in many of those what would you do situations, you see instances of people being singled out based on the way they look and under police surveillance all the time based on the way they look, etc. So it just tells you that even at the state level, that this discrimination that is validated by institutional policy could be very, very pervasive. And in time, what it does, it leads to a situation in which that becomes established as the truth or the reality. It's, this particular step diagram tells you it's the manufactured reality. It's really a construction, really, of social reality. People take, if we go back to the beginning, the selective information to form the biases. Well, that selective information, the limited information that is reinforced by schools, parents, teachers, media, everything, they take that selected information, and with that selective information, they form opinions. And the opinions that generate the kind of subjective response to people and may in fact lead to a situation in which people either fear the other or distrust the other. So we go from there, and then you can see how those biases could harden, all right? Could harden into a situation in which we find that there is prejudice. And as I said, everybody has prejudices. Problem with prejudices is that we don't always have to act on them. If we look at the role of stereotypes in creating prejudice or in sustaining prejudice, clearly you see this very much so in how certain individuals and groups are represented in the media, so that it helps to increase the amount of fear, for example. So you see, 10 young people going into a mall, there is a natural assumption that if 10 young people going into the mall, that they are going there to create trouble. So you have many instances that a lot of stereotyping around youth and criminality actually leads to that.